this immersive journey through the world of medieval knights and castles, a fascinating period of history that continues to capture our imagination today. In this extensive exploration, we will travel back in time to the Middle Ages, when powerful stone fortresses dominated the landscape, and armored warriors lived by codes of chivalry and honor. We'll discover how castles evolved from simple wooden structures to imposing stone fortifications, how knights developed from mounted warriors to a distinct social class, and how these two elements shaped medieval society for centuries. The period we refer to as medieval or the Middle Ages spans roughly from the 5th century to the late 15th century, beginning with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and ending with the dawn of the Renaissance. This 1,000-year period saw dramatic changes in warfare, architecture, social structures, and culture across Europe. At the heart of medieval military and social systems were the knight and the castle, two deeply interconnected elements that defined the era. Let us begin with the origins of medieval knights, tracing their evolution from simple mounted warriors to the iconic armored figures of legend. The word knight derives from the Old English term knight, which simply meant boy or servant, reflecting the humble beginnings of what would become an elite warrior class. The concept of knights as we understand them today began to take shape during the reign of Charlemagne in the 8th century, when mounted warriors became increasingly important to military strategy. After the collapse of the Carolingian Empire in the 9th century, Europe fractured into many smaller territories. Local lords needed protection, and mounted warriors provided an effective military force. These early knights were not yet the noble figures of later medieval romance, but rather professional soldiers who served the Lord in exchange for land or payment. They fought on horseback with spears, swords, and shields, giving them significant advantages over infantry on the battlefield. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 provides a vivid example of the growing importance of knights in warfare. The Battle of Hastings, depicted in the famous Bayeux Tapestry, shows Norman knights charging on horseback, using the shock tactics that would become their signature fighting style. William the Conqueror's victory relied heavily on these mounted warriors, and after claiming the English throne, he rewarded his knights with land, further cementing their status as a military elite. By the 11th century, the concept of knighthood had begun to incorporate elements beyond pure military service. The Church, seeking to moderate the violence of these powerful warriors, began promoting ideals of chivalry that combined martial prowess with Christian virtues. Knights were increasingly expected to protect the weak, uphold justice, and serve God as well as their earthly lords. The Crusades, beginning in 1095, further linked knighthood with religious devotion, as thousands of knights journeyed to the Holy Land to fight for Christendom. and 13th centuries witnessed the golden age of knighthood, when the romantic ideals of chivalry reached their peak. Knights were now firmly established as a noble class, distinguished by their military training, heraldic symbols, and codes of conduct. Literature of this period, such as the Arthurian legends and chansons de geste, glorified knights as paragons of courage, loyalty, and courtly love. These stories continue to influence our perception of medieval knights today, though they often portray a more idealized version than historical reality. The path to knighthood was long and arduous, beginning in childhood and requiring years of training. At around age 7, boys from noble families would be sent to serve in the household of a lord or relative, where they would begin their education as pages. Pages learned basic skills such as how to serve at table, proper courtly behavior, and the fundamentals of combat and horsemanship. They also received religious instruction and sometimes learned to read and write, though literacy was not universal among knights. At around age 14, a page would become a squire, assigned to serve a specific knight. The role of a squire was far more demanding, as he was responsible for caring for his knight's horses and weapons, assisting him in donning his armor, and even fighting alongside him in battle. Squires received intensive training in combat techniques, learning to fight with sword, lance, mace, and other weapons while wearing increasingly heavy armor. They also learned to hunt, hawk, and participate in tournaments, all essential skills for a future knight. After years as a squire, typically in his late teens or early 20s, a young man might be deemed ready for knighthood. The ceremony of knighthood evolved over time, becoming increasingly elaborate and symbolic. In the early Middle Ages, it might be as simple as receiving weapons and armor from a lord, or even a quick dubbing on the battlefield for exceptional bravery. By the High Middle Ages, however, it had become a solemn religious ceremony rich with symbolism. A typical knighting ceremony in the 13th century would begin with purification rituals, including a bath to symbolize spiritual cleansing. The candidate would then keep an all-night vigil in a church, praying before the altar with his weapons. In the morning, he would attend Mass before being dressed in symbolic clothing, often including a white tunic representing purity, a red robe for the blood he might shed, and a black coat recalling the death he might face. The climax of the ceremony was the accolade, when the presiding lord or knight would tap the kneeling candidate on each shoulder with the flat of a sword, pronouncing him a knight. This was followed by the presentation of the symbols of knighthood, including spurs, a sword, a shield, and sometimes a banner bearing the new knight's coat of arms. The ceremony often concluded with the new knight demonstrating his skills, perhaps by mounting his his horse in full armor or performing feats of arms. Once dubbed a knight, a warrior became part of an elite brotherhood with specific privileges and responsibilities. Knights were expected to follow the code of chivalry, which emphasized virtues such as courage, loyalty, generosity, and courtesy. They were bound to serve their lords in war, typically providing 40 days of military service per year, though arrangements varied widely across Europe and throughout the medieval period. A knight's primary military role was as heavy cavalry, charging into battle on horseback to break enemy formations. The effectiveness of this tactic relied on several technological developments, including the high-back saddle, which prevented a knight from being unseated by the impact of his lance strike, and the stirrup, which allowed him to stand in the saddle and deliver more powerful blows. By the 12th century, knights had developed the couch lance technique, tucking their lances under their arms to transfer the full momentum of their charging horses into devastating impacts. A knight's equipment was extraordinarily expensive, often costing the equivalent of several years' income from a substantial manor. At the heart of a knight's gear was his armor, which evolved dramatically throughout the medieval period. Early knights wore chainmail, flexible armor made of interlocking metal rings that offered good protection against cuts but less against crushing blows or arrows. A mail hauberk, or shirt, was typically worn over a padded gambeson for additional protection and to prevent chafing. By the 13th century, knights began adding plates of solid metal to vulnerable areas, leading to the transitional code of plate-style armor. The 14th century saw the development of full-plate armor, covering the knight from head to toe in articulated steel plates. Contrary to popular belief, well-made plate armor allowed considerable mobility, as it was custom-fitted to the wearer and designed with articulated joints. A knight in full plate could run, mount his horse, and even somersault, though the weight of 50 to 80 pounds did cause fatigue during prolonged combat. The knight's helmet also evolved over time, from the simple conical helmets of the early medieval period to the gray helm of the 12th and 13th centuries, a massive cylinder of metal that covered the entire head. By the 14th century, the more articulated bassinet with a movable visor became popular, offering better visibility and ventilation when not in direct combat. These helmets were often adorned with crests, plumes, or other decorations that helped identify the knight on the battlefield and added to his imposing appearance. A knight's primary weapons included the lance, a long wooden pole with a metal tip used for charging, and the sword, which held both practical and symbolic importance. Medieval swords were typically double-edged with a simple crossguard, designed for both cutting and thrusting. Knights also used various secondary weapons, including daggers, maces, armored opponents where blunt force could be more effective than cutting weapons. The knight's most valuable possession was his warhorse or destrier, specially bred and trained for battle. These were not the massive draft horses often depicted in films, but powerful, agile animals more comparable to modern hunters or larger sport horses. A good destrier needed to be fearless in battle, responsive to commands even amid chaos, and capable of carrying a fully armored knight for extended periods. These horses were so valuable that knights typically rode ordinary palfreys for travel, saving their war horses for battle or tournaments. Speaking of tournaments, these martial competitions became a central feature of knightly culture from the 11th century onward. Early tournaments were little more than organized melees, with teams of knights fighting in open fields using weapons only slightly less lethal than those used in war. These events were extraordinarily dangerous, with numerous fatalities and serious injuries. Over time, tournaments became more formalized and somewhat safer, with greater emphasis on individual jousting and rules to reduce fatalities. The classic joust, where two knights charged at each other with lances along a dividing barrier called a tilt, became the centerpiece of later medieval tournaments. Knights would attempt to strike their opponents' shields or helmets, with the goal of breaking their lances dramatically or unhorsing their opponents entirely. Tournaments served multiple purposes, including military training, entertainment for spectators, and opportunities for knights to gain fame, demonstrate their prowess, and win valuable prizes. Tournaments also became elaborate social occasions, with pageantry, heraldic displays, and courtly romance. Knights might fight wearing their lady's favor, such as a sleeve or scarf, and victories were celebrated with feasts and dancing. By the later Middle Ages, tournaments had become highly theatrical events, with knights adopting personas and elaborate scenarios based on Arthurian legends or other romantic tales. The development of heraldry, a system of hereditary symbols displayed on shields, surcoats, and banners, was closely tied to the tournament culture. Heraldic devices allowed knights to be identified on the battlefield or tournament ground even when their faces were concealed by helmets. These symbols began as simple geometric designs or animals in the 12th century, but grew increasingly complex, eventually developing into a sophisticated system with its own terminology and rules. Despite the romantic image of the knight as a purely military figure, most knights spent relatively little time actually fighting. In peacetime, knights served as administrators of their estates, participated in their lords' councils, and dispensed justice in manorial courts. Many knights were essentially country gentlemen, managing agricultural lands and supervising peasant labor. The income income from these lands supported their military obligations, funding the expensive equipment and training required for knighthood. Not all knights were wealthy landowners. However, particularly in the later Middle Ages, some were household knights who served in a lord's retinue permanently, receiving maintenance and pay rather than land. Others became mercenaries, selling their military skills to the highest bidder, while some joined military orders like the Knights Templar or Knights Hospitaller, combining religious devotion with martial prowess. The social status of knights varied across Europe and throughout the medieval period. In some regions, knighthood was closely tied to nobility, with only the sons of nobles eligible to become knights. In others, particularly in the earlier Middle Ages, knighthood was more accessible to men of non-noble birth who proved their military worth. By the late Middle Ages, the distinction between knights and nobles had blurred in many areas, with knighthood becoming essentially a lower rank of nobility. The decline of knighthood as a military institution began in the 14th century, driven by several factors. The development of professional infantry armies, armed with weapons like the English longbow and Swiss pike, challenged the battlefield supremacy of heavily armored cavalry. The catastrophic defeats of French knights by English archers at Crécy and Agincourt demonstrated that the age of knight dominance was waning. The introduction of gunpowder weapons in the late Middle Ages further eroded the knight's military value, as no amount of armor could protect against early firearms. Economically, the cost of equipping a knight continued to rise as armor became more elaborate, while the relative value of mounted shock troops decreased. The system of feudal service that had supported knighthood was gradually replaced by paid professional armies. By the 16th century, the knight as a battlefield force had largely disappeared, though the social class and many traditions of knighthood persisted in the form of the aristocracy. Yet even as the practical military role of knights diminished, their cultural importance grew. The late Middle Ages saw an explosion of romantic literature glorifying the ideals of chivalry, from Sir Thomas Malory's The Morte d'Arthur to countless poems and songs celebrating manly virtues. In many ways, the knight reached his greatest cultural significance just as his military relevance was fading, becoming more symbol than soldier. The legacy of medieval knighthood continues to resonate in modern culture, from films and literature to our very language. Terms like chivalry and gallant derive from knightly ideals, while contemporary honor systems like British knighthoods explicitly reference medieval traditions. Modern military academies still emphasize many virtues associated with the knightly code, including honor, loyalty, and service. Even in our digital age, the powerful image of the armored knight continues to symbolize courage, nobility, and the warrior ethos. attention to their inseparable counterparts, the magnificent stone fortresses known as castles. Just as knights evolved from simple mounted warriors to complex social figures, castles developed from basic defensive structures to elaborate architectural wonders that served multiple purposes in medieval society. The story of the medieval castle begins in the turbulent years following the collapse of the Carolingian Empire in the 9th century. As central authority weakened across Europe, local lords needed to protect themselves and their territories from raiders and rival nobles. The earliest defensive structures were simple earthwork enclosures surrounded by wooden palisades, often built on naturally defensible locations like hilltops or river bends. These modern Bailey castles, as they are now known, featured a raised mound, the motte, topped by a wooden tower, alongside a larger enclosed area, the bailey, containing additional buildings. While effective as temporary defenses, these wooden structures had significant limitations. They were vulnerable to fire, required constant maintenance as timber rotted, and lacked the imposing psychological impact of more permanent fortifications. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 marked a turning point in castle construction, as William the Conqueror and his followers built a network of castles to secure their control over their newly conquered territory. Initially, these Norman castles were modern Bailey designs, which could be constructed quickly to establish control. However, the Normans soon began replacing wooden structures with stone, creating more permanent and formidable fortifications. The Tower of London, begun in the 1070s, exemplifies this transition, with its massive stone keep rising above the River Thames as a symbol of Norman power. The 12th century saw the widespread adoption of stone castles across Europe, as improving economic conditions and political stability allowed for more ambitious construction projects. The basic form of these early stone castles was the shell keep, where the wooden palisade on top of the motte was replaced by a stone wall, or the stone keep, a massive square or rectangular tower with enormously thick walls. These stone keeps, such as the one at Rochester Castle in England, served as both the last line of defense and the lord's residence. The typical stone keep was a formidable structure, with walls up to 20 feet thick at the base, narrowing as they rose to heights of 3 or 4 stories. The ground floor usually contained storage areas, while the upper floors housed the Great Hall, Lord's Chamber, and other living spaces. Windows were small and few, particularly on the lower levels, prioritizing defense over comfort. A single entrance, typically reached by an external staircase that could be destroyed in times of danger, provided the only access. The late 12th and 13th centuries brought significant innovations in castle design, influenced partly by experiences during the Crusades, where European knights encountered the sophisticated fortifications of the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. Castle builders began to focus on the concept of defense in depth, with multiple layers of walls, towers, and other obstacles that an attacker would need to overcome sequentially. This period saw the development of the concentric castle, featuring an inner high wall surrounded by a lower outer wall. This design allowed defenders on the inner wall to fire over the heads of those on the outer wall, creating overlapping fields of fire against attackers. Concentric castles reached their peak with massive structures like Caerphilly Castle in Wales and Croc des Chevaliers in Syria, the latter described by T.E. Lawrence as perhaps the best preserved and most wholly admirable castle in the world. Round towers began to replace square towers during this period, as they eliminated vulnerable corners and better deflected projectiles. The houses became increasingly elaborate, evolving from simple entrances to complex defensive structures with multiple portcullises, murder holes for dropping objects on attackers, and bent entrances that forced enemies to make difficult turns while under fire from defenders. The reign of Edward I of England in the late 13th century produced some of the most sophisticated castles ever built as part of his campaign to subdue Wales. Castles such as Conwy, Carnarvon, and Harlech represented the pinnacle of medieval military architecture, combining defensive effectiveness with symbolic power. These castles were strategically placed to control key routes and settlements, often integrated with walled towns to create comprehensive defensive systems. Carnarvon Castle deserves special mention for its unique polygonal towers and banded masonry, deliberately designed to evoke the walls of Constantinople and biblical references. This was not merely decorative but deeply symbolic, associating Edward's rule with imperial authority and divine legitimacy. The castle wasn't just a military structure but a political statement in stone, proclaiming Edward's power and ambition to both the Welsh population and his own nobles. While we often focus on the military aspects of castles, they were fundamentally residential buildings as well as fortresses. The Great Hall formed the heart of castle life, a multi-purpose space where the Lord dined, held court, received visitors, and administered justice. Most castle halls followed a standard layout, with a high table on a dais at one end for the lord and honored guests, and lower tables perpendicular to it for household members and retainers. The Lord's private chamber or solar provided a retreat from the public nature of the Great Hall. These chambers grew increasingly comfortable over time, with features like fireplaces, window seats, and private latrines or guardrobes. By the 14th century, the solar had often expanded into a suite of rooms, including separate bedchambers, dressing rooms, and sometimes private chapels. Castles required extensive support facilities to function, particularly during sieges when they needed to be self-sufficient. Kitchens were typically located away from main living areas due to fire risk, often in separate buildings within the bailey. Massive fireplaces, spits, and ovens allowed cooks to prepare food for the entire household, which might number hundreds of people in larger castles. Nearby buildings would house specialized functions like bakeries, brewhouses, and butteries for storing wine and ale. Water supply was a crucial consideration in castle design, particularly for fortresses that might face extended sieges. Some castles incorporated wells within their walls, often dug to extraordinary depths to reach groundwater. The well at Orford Castle in England, for example, extends over 200 feet into the earth. Other castles relied on rainwater collection systems or cisterns, while those near rivers sometimes featured protected passages to secure water access. Food storage areas were equally important, with granaries, larders, and salt stores allowing provisions to be stockpiled for long periods. Castle cellars kept perishable foods cool, while smoking and salting preserved meat and fish. Even with these measures, food supplies during sieges were often limited and monotonous, with fresh vegetables and fruits quickly exhausted. Sanitation in castles was more sophisticated than commonly believed, though still rudimentary by modern standards. Guardropes or privies discharged waste through chutes in the castle walls, ideally positioned over moats or running water. Better castles featured multiple guardropes on different levels, sometimes arranged in vertical stacks to create a primitive form of plumbing. Archaeological evidence suggests that some castles also had dedicated washing areas and drainage systems to manage household waste. The chapel was another essential element of castle architecture, reflecting the central role of Christianity in medieval life. Castle chapels ranged from simple rooms with an altar to elaborate structures with vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows. In larger castles, the chapel might be staffed by resident priests who provided daily religious services and served as members of the Lord's household. These sacred spaces offered spiritual comfort to castle inhabitants and underscored the Lord's piety and status. The people who lived and worked in medieval castles formed a complex community structured along strict hierarchical lines. At the top stood the Lord and his family, who might be in residence continuously or move between multiple estates depending on their wealth and political responsibilities. Below them were household knights and officials like the constable, who managed the castle's defenses, and the steward, who oversights day-to-day operations. A substantial staff of servants maintained the castle, including cooks, bakers, brewers, laundresses, and cleaners. Specialized craftsmen might also live and work within the castle walls, including blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, and armorers. During peacetime, the permanent garrison might be quite small, consisting of a few men-at-arms and watchmen, though this number would swell dramatically in times of war or unrest. Life in a medieval castle followed seasonal and daily rhythms dictated by natural light, religious observances, and agricultural cycles. The day typically began at dawn with religious services, followed by the main meal around mid-morning. Work filled the daylight hours, with a lighter evening meal before darkness fell. Artificial lighting from candles and oil lamps was expensive and limited, so most activities followed the natural day. Winter in a castle could be particularly challenging, with cold stone walls and limited heating from fireplaces and braziers. Tapestries and wooden paneling provided some insulation, while members of the household might share beds for warmth. The short days meant more time spent indoors, engaged in activities like storytelling, music, games of chance, and handicrafts. For the nobility, winter was also a season for hunting, an activity that provided both recreation and supplemented the castle's food supplies. Summer brought more comfortable conditions and a shift in activities. Castle courtyards became centers of outdoor work, and windows that had been shuttered against winter cold could be opened to admit light and air. This was also the typical season for construction and repair work, as well as for military campaigns. Lords might travel more during summer, visiting their various properties or attending court, while leaving their castles under the management of trusted officials. The primary purpose of castles was military, and they were designed to withstand various forms of attack. The most common approach to taking a well-defended castle was not direct assault but siege, cutting the fortress off from supplies and waiting for hunger, thirst, or disease to force surrender. Sieges could last months or even years, though most were resolved more quickly as the economic and political costs mounted for both sides. When direct attacks were attempted, they employed a variety of specialized equipment and techniques. Scaling ladders were the simplest approach, though they exposed attackers to deadly fire from defenders above. Siege towers or belfries, massive wooden structures on wheels, could be rolled up to walls to deliver attackers directly to the battlements, bypassing the dangerous climb. These towers were vulnerable to fire, however, and required relatively flat ground to operate effectively. Battering rams, often housed in protective wooden sheds called tortoise shells, to be used against gates or walls. More sophisticated approaches involved undermining, where tunnels were dug beneath castle walls, supported by wooden props, and then burned to collapse sections of the defenses. This was particularly effective against castles built on soft ground, though useless against against those on solid rock. Various projectile weapons were employed in medieval sieges, from simple catapults to complex trebuchets capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds. These engines could damage walls over time, though they were most effective against roofs and internal structures. They were also used psychologically, sometimes launching diseased animal carcasses or even the severed heads of captured messengers into castles to spread disease and terror. Defenders had their own specialized techniques and equipment. Battlements allowed archers and crossbowmen to fire while protected, while machicolations, projecting galleries with holes in the floor, permitted defenders to drop objects directly onto enemies at the base of the walls. Boiling oil, often mentioned in popular culture, was rarely used due to its expense, but boiling water, heated sand, and quicklime served similar purposes. By the late 14th century, castles faced a new threat that would ultimately render them obsolete: gunpowder weapons. Early cannon were unreliable and inaccurate, but they improved rapidly. The siege of Constantinople in 1453 demonstrated the devastating effect of artillery on traditional fortifications, with Ottoman cannons breaching walls that had stood for a millennium. Castle designers responded with innovations like lower, thicker walls and angled bastions, but the age of the medieval castle was drawing to a close. As the military value of castles declined, their residential and administrative functions gained prominence. Many castles were gradually transformed into more comfortable palaces or country houses, with larger windows, more spacious rooms, and elaborate gardens. Others were abandoned or fell into ruin as their owners chose to build new residences better suited to changing tastes and requirements. Some remain centers of local government, housing courts, administrative offices, and sometimes prisons. The symbolic importance of castles often outlasted their practical utility. Even as gunpowder weapons made traditional fortifications increasingly obsolete, rulers continued to build and maintain castles as expressions of power and legitimacy. The massive scale and imposing appearance of a stone castle made a clear statement about its owner's wealth, authority, and permanence. This symbolism explains why castle imagery remains so potent even today, instantly evoking notions of strength, security, and feudal power. The relationship between knights and castles was symbiotic. Castles provided knights with secure bases from which to control territory, while knights supplied the military expertise and manpower needed to defend castles effectively. The feudal system that underpinned medieval society linked both to the distribution of land and the obligations of military service. A lord granted land to his knights in return for their service, which included castle guard duty for a specified number of days each year. times of peace, castles served as centers of local administration and justice. The lord or his representatives held court in the Great Hall, settling disputes among tenants and enforcing customary laws. Rents and other dues were collected at the castle, while the lord's officials managed agricultural production and other economic activities across his estates. Castles thus functioned as the hubs of feudal networks, connecting political, military, economic, and social aspects of medieval life. Many castles also served as cultural centers, particularly in the High Middle Ages. Courts attracted not only warriors and administrators, but also artists, musicians, poets, and scholars. The troubadour tradition of southern France and the Minnesinger culture of Germany flourished in castle settings, where poetry and music celebrating chivalric ideals entertained noble audiences. Castles with substantial libraries, like those of some ecclesiastical lords, preserved classical knowledge and supported intellectual activity. The educational role of castles should not be overlooked. For young nobles, time spent serving in the household of a greater lord provided essential training in military skills, courtly behavior, and administration. They learned by observation and practice, watching how experienced knights and officials conducted themselves and gradually taking on responsibilities under supervision. This apprenticeship system transmitted not only practical skills but also cultural values and social norms from one generation to the next. Castle architecture reflected the dual military and social roles of these structures. The Great Hall, for example, served as both a defensible space within the castle and the setting for elaborate social rituals. Even as castle design evolved to address changing military threats, it also responded to shifting expectations about comfort, privacy, and display. The tension between defensive requirements and residential desires produced some of the most interesting features of medieval castles, as architects sought creative solutions to seemingly contradictory demands. Regional variations in castle design reflected differences in geography, available building materials, cultural influences, and military requirements. Stone castles predominated in regions where suitable building stone was readily available, while brick became important in areas like northern Germany and the Low Countries where stone was scarce. In mountainous regions, castles often incorporated natural rock formations into their defenses, while those in flat areas relied more heavily on moats and earthworks. The castles of Spain show clear Islamic influences, reflecting the centuries of Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula and the subsequent Reconquista. Features like decorative tile work, interior courtyards, and sophisticated water management systems distinguish these structures from their northern European counterparts. The Alcazar of Segovia and the Alhambra in Granada exemplify this fusion of Islamic and Christian architectural traditions, creating some of the most beautiful fortified complexes in Europe. Italian castles reflected the unique political situation of medieval Italy, with its powerful city-states and competing factions. Urban castles like the Castello Sforzesco in Milan served as much to control the city population as to defend against external threats. The tower houses of San Gimignano represent another distinctly Italian form, where wealthy families built tall defensive towers within city limits as symbols of their power and as refuges during civic unrest. In Eastern Europe, castles often developed later than in the West, but incorporated lessons learned from centuries of Western European castle building. The Teutonic Knights constructed massive brick fortresses like Malbork Castle in Poland, which remains the largest castle in the world by land area. These structures combine the latest military innovations with the administrative facilities needed to control vast territories. The Crusader castles built in the Holy Land and Eastern Mediterranean represent a fascinating fusion of European and Middle Eastern military architecture. Knights from various European countries brought their own traditions, but adapted them to local conditions and learned from Byzantine and Islamic fortification techniques. Castles like Croc des Chevaliers in Syria and Belfour in Israel were designed to be held by relatively small garrisons against much larger forces, emphasizing defensive strength over residential comfort. The construction of a major castle was an enormous undertaking, requiring vast resources and specialized knowledge. Building a stone castle might take a decade or more, depending on the size and complexity of the structure, the availability of materials and labor, and the political and economic circumstances. The cost was equally staggering, sometimes exceeding the entire annual income from a lord's estates. The process began with site selection, considering factors like defensive potential, access to water, proximity to important routes, and control of valuable resources. Once a site was chosen, a master mason would be engaged to design the castle and oversee its construction. These master builders were highly skilled professionals who might work on multiple projects throughout their careers, gradually refining their understanding of structural engineering and defensive architecture. Materials for castle building were ideally sourced locally to reduce transportation costs. Stone was quarried, shaped, and dressed by specialized masons, while timber for floors, roofs, and scaffolding came from nearby forests. Lime for mortar was produced by burning limestone in kilns, then mixing it with sand and water. Iron for hinges, locks, and other fittings was forged by blacksmiths, often in workshops established at the construction site. Labor for castle construction came from various sources. craftsmen like masons, carpenters, and blacksmiths were paid wages, sometimes being brought from considerable distances for major projects. Unskilled labor might come from local peasants fulfilling feudal obligations, paid laborers, or even prisoners of war. During the Crusades, pilgrims sometimes contributed voluntary labor to castle building as a form of religious devotion. The scale of some castle building projects was truly impressive. Edward I's castle at Beaumaris, for example, employed nearly 3,500 workers at the peak of construction, including 400 masons, 30 blacksmiths, and 200 carpenters, along with thousands of laborers. The logistics of housing, feeding, and managing such a workforce presented challenges comparable to the actual construction work. Once completed, castles required constant maintenance to remain effective. Stone walls needed repointing, wooden structures required replacement as they rotted, and weaponry had to be kept in good repair. This ongoing maintenance represented a significant expense for castle owners, particularly as castles aged and problems accumulated. Many castles fell into disrepair not because of enemy action, but due to the prohibitive cost of proper maintenance. The late medieval period saw significant changes in both castle design and the role of knights. As gunpowder weapons became more effective, traditional high-walled castles became increasingly vulnerable. Engineers responded by developing new fortification styles with lower, thicker walls, angled bastions, and gun ports for defensive artillery. These transitional fortifications bridged the gap between medieval castles and the Tres Italiane or star forts of the Renaissance era. Similarly, knights adapted to changing battlefield conditions by modifying their equipment and tactics. Plate armor reached its technical peak in the 15th century, with magnificently crafted suits that provided excellent protection while maintaining reasonable mobility. However, as firearms became more powerful and common, even the best armor became increasingly ineffective. Knights began to adopt lighter equipment for greater mobility, eventually abandoning full plate armor entirely. The economic and social foundations of knighthood also shifted during this period. The feudal system that had supported knights through land grants was gradually replaced by more centralized forms of government and monetary economies. Many knights became mercenaries, selling their military skills to the highest bidder rather than serving a feudal lord. Others transitioned into civilian roles as administrators, courtiers, or country gentlemen, maintaining the social status of knighthood while abandoning its military function. By the 16th century, the medieval knight and castle had largely given way to new military realities. professional armies armed with gunpowder weapons fought on battlefields dominated by infantry and artillery. Defense relied increasingly on earthworks and angled bastions rather than high stone walls. Yet the cultural legacy of knights and castles persisted, romanticized in literature and art even as their practical relevance faded. This romanticization accelerated during the Gothic revival of the 18th and 19th centuries, when interest in medieval architecture and chivalric ideals surged. Wealthy individuals built mock medieval castles as residences, while existing medieval structures were restored, often with more concern for romantic appeal than historical accuracy. Writers like Sir Walter Scott popularized idealized versions of medieval knighthood, cementing the knight as a symbol of honor, courage, and nobility in the popular imagination. Today, medieval castles rank among the most popular historical attractions in Europe, drawing millions of visitors annually. Some remain in private ownership, while others are managed by government agencies or nonprofit organizations dedicated to their preservation. Conservation efforts balance maintaining historical authenticity with providing access and educational opportunities for the public. Modern technology has enhanced our understanding of these structures with archaeological techniques, digital mapping, and virtual reconstructions revealing aspects of castle life previously unknown. The ideals associated with medieval knighthood continue to influence contemporary culture in surprising ways. Modern military academies still emphasize many chivalric virtues, while terms derived from knighthood pepper our language and conceptual frameworks. Films, literature, and games set in medieval or medieval-inspired worlds remained enormously popular, allowing modern audiences to engage with romanticized versions of knight-errantry and castle life. As we conclude our exploration of medieval knights and castles, it's worth reflecting on why these subjects continue to fascinate us. Perhaps it's the combination of tangible history, stone fortresses we can still touch and explore, with the romantic ideals of honor, courage, and adventure that knights came to represent. Or perhaps it's simply that the medieval world, with its stark contrast and vivid imagery, offers a counterpoint to our own complex, often ambiguous times. Whatever the reason, a legacy of knights and castles endures, not just in preserved structures and museum artifacts, but in our collective imagination. They remind us of a time when power was made manifest in stone and steel, when oaths and honor shaped social relationships, and when the landscape itself was transformed by the human desire for security, status, and control. In studying these aspects of medieval life, we gain insight not only into a fascinating historical period, but also into perennial aspects of human nature and society. The The lives of medieval knights and the stone castles they inhabited represent one of history's most compelling chapters. A time when courage was measured in steel, power was etched in stone, and honor meant everything. Though centuries have passed since knights rode forth from castle gates, their legacy continues to inspire and instruct, reminding us that even in our modern world, the virtues they championed, courage, loyalty, honor, and service, remain as relevant and necessary as ever. Now let's delve deeper into some fascinating aspects of medieval knighthood that we haven't yet explored. One particularly interesting dimension is the relationship between knights and religion, which was far more complex than popular culture often suggests. While knights were expected to defend the church and Christian values, their profession inherently involved violence, creating a moral tension that medieval society struggled to reconcile. The church's attitude toward knighthood evolved significantly over time. Early medieval clerics often condemned knights as sinful agents of violence, little better than bandits in their brutality. By the 11th century, however, church leaders began developing the concept of the Miles Christi or soldier of Christ, arguing that knights who fought for righteous causes could use their martial skills in God's service. This transformation culminated in the blessing of knights' swords and equipment, incorporating knighthood into the sacred order of society. The Crusades represented the fullest expression of this sanctified view of knighthood. When Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, he offered spiritual rewards to knights who fought to reclaim the Holy Land. For many knights, crusading offered a way to fulfill both their warrior identity and religious obligations simultaneously. The military orders that emerged from the crusading movement, such as the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, took this fusion of religion and warfare to its logical conclusion. The Knights Templar deserve special attention as perhaps the most famous of these military orders. Founded around 1119 to protect pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, the Templars combined the disciplines of monks with the skills of warriors. They lived by a strict rule, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, while simultaneously training for combat and managing extensive properties across Europe. Their distinctive white mantles bearing red crosses made them immediately recognizable on the battlefield. The Templars' dual identity as both monks and warriors made them uniquely positioned to develop financial services. Pilgrims could deposit funds at a Templar house in Europe and withdraw them in the Holy Land, using a system of letters of credit that functioned much like modern travelers' checks. This banking activity, combined with donations and efficient management of their estates, made the Templars enormously wealthy and influential. Eventually, their power contributed to their downfall, as King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the order, moved against them in 1307. systematic suppression of the Templars, involving arrests, torture, confessions of heresy, and ultimately burning at the stake for many members, created one of history's most enduring conspiracy theories. Though historical evidence suggests the charges were fabricated to justify seizing their wealth, legends about secret Templar knowledge, hidden treasures, and clandestine survival continue to this day, appearing in countless books, films, and games. While the Templars met a tragic end, other military orders adapted and survived. The Knights Hospitaller, originally founded to care for sick pilgrims, evolved into a significant naval power based in Rhodes and later Malta, continuing to fight against Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean for centuries. The Teutonic Knights established a state in the Baltic region, while the Spanish orders of Calatrava, Santiago, and Alcantara played crucial roles in the reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. Even knights who were not members of religious orders were expected to demonstrate piety. The ideal knight attended Mass daily, prayed regularly, fasted on prescribed days, and supported religious institutions through donations. Many knights embarked on pilgrimages as acts of devotion or penance, traveling to sites like Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Rome, or Jerusalem. Knights' tombs often depict them with hands folded in prayer, emphasizing their religious identity alongside their martial status. Another fascinating aspect of knighthood was the development of heraldry, a complex system of visual identification that became inextricably linked with knightly culture. Heraldry originated from the practical need to identify fully armored knights on the battlefield or tournament ground, but it evolved into an elaborate art form with its own specialized vocabulary and rules. The central element of heraldry was the coat of arms, a distinctive design displayed on a knight's shield, surcoat, and banner. Early coats of arms were relatively simple, featuring basic geometric patterns or stylized animals in limited colors. Over time, they grew increasingly complex, incorporating multiple elements that often reflected family alliances, territorial holdings, or significant achievements. Heraldic designs followed strict rules regarding color combinations, with metals, gold and silver, represented as yellow and white, never placed directly on each other, and colors, red, blue, green, black, and purple, similarly kept separate. This rule ensured maximum visibility and contrast, essential for battlefield identification. Designs were described using a specialized Anglo-Norman vocabulary that remains in use by heraldic authorities today. By the 13th century, heraldry had become hereditary, with coats of arms passing from father to son with appropriate modifications to distinguish different branches of a family. This development was closely tied to the increasing emphasis on noble lineage, as knighthood became less a matter of function and more a matter of birth. Elaborate genealogies were compiled, tracing family histories through their heraldic achievements, real or sometimes invented. Tournaments provided the perfect setting for heraldic display, with knights presenting themselves in their finest equipment adorned with family arms. Special officials called heralds managed these events, announcing participants, keeping score, and ensuring that only those entitled to bear arms competed. These heralds eventually became responsible for recording and regulating coats of arms more generally, developing into institutions like the College of Arms in England, which continues to function today. The visual culture of heraldry spread beyond shields and banners to influence medieval art more broadly. Heraldic designs appeared in manuscript illuminations, stained glass windows, tomb effigies, architectural decoration, and personal seals. Even everyday objects owned by noble families might be decorated with their arms, from tableware to furniture. This omnipresence of heraldic imagery reinforced social hierarchies, making rank and lineage visible in virtually every aspect of elite medieval life. Turning back to castles, let's examine how these structures function within the broader context of medieval warfare and territorial control. Castles were never isolated fortifications, but components of strategic networks that controlled movement through landscapes, protected valuable resources, and projected political authority. The strategic placement of castles was crucial to their effectiveness. Many were built to command important transportation routes, particularly river crossings, mountain passes, or major roads. Others protected natural resources like mines, forests, or productive agricultural land. In frontier regions, networks of castles created defensive perimeters, often with smaller outposts reporting to larger central fortresses. The Welsh castles of Edward I provide an excellent example of strategic castle placement. After conquering Wales in the late 13th century, Edward constructed a ring of massive stone castles at key locations along the coast, including Conwy, Carnarvon, Harlech, and Beaumaris. These fortresses could be supplied by sea even if the surrounding countryside rose in rebellion, allowing relatively small English garrisons to control Welsh territory effectively. The castles were integrated with new English towns, creating centers of economic and cultural influence as well as military power. In the Holy Land, Crusader castles formed networks of mutual support designed to control key routes and protect Christian settlements. Major fortresses like Croix des Chevaliers anchored these networks, while smaller outposts provided early warning of enemy movements and controlled local populations. Given the Crusaders' numerical disadvantage. These castle networks were essential for maintaining Latin Christian states in a predominantly Muslim region. Castle design evolved differently in different regions, responding to local conditions and threats. In Scotland, many castles featured tall, slender towers called keeps or tower houses, which provided good visibility across often mountainous terrain. In Ireland, circular towers became popular, while in Eastern Europe, brick construction predominated where good building stone was scarce. These regional variations reflect the adaptability of medieval military architecture to diverse environments. The relationship between castles and settlements was complex and varied. Some castles were built in isolated locations, prioritizing defensive advantages over accessibility or comfort. Others were constructed alongside existing settlements to protect and control them, while still others became the nuclei around which new towns developed. The latter pattern was particularly common in newly conquered or colonized regions, where castles served as secure bases for establishing foreign control. Planned castle towns represent a fascinating aspect of medieval development. In these settlements, a castle and adjacent town were designed as an integrated unit, often surrounded by a common defensive wall. Streets were laid out in grid patterns, with space allocated for markets, churches, and administrative buildings. Such planned developments occurred across Europe, from the Bastides of southwestern France to the Ordensborgen of the Teutonic Knights in Prussia and the English foundations in Wales. Carnarvon in Wales exemplifies this integrated approach. Edward I's magnificent castle was built alongside a planned town, both protected by massive walls. English settlers were encouraged to move to the new town, bringing their language, laws, and customs. The castle served not only as a military stronghold but as a center of government, with apartments for royal visitors, exchequer facilities, and a grand hall for ceremonies and administration. Castle and town together formed a complete package of colonial control. The administrative functions of castles were as important as their military roles. Many castles house government offices, courts, and treasuries, serving as centers for tax collection, record keeping, and the administration of justice. Castle constables, appointed by the crown or local lord, exercise broad authority over surrounding territories, making these fortresses centers of political as well as military power. Royal castles in particular often contain specialized spaces for governmental functions. The Tower of London, for example, housed the Royal Mint, the Royal Menagerie, and at times the Royal Treasury. It also served as a prison for high-status captives, an armory, and a secure storage facility for important documents. These varied roles made the tower a microcosm of royal power, combining military strength with administrative capacity and symbolic authority. The economic impact of castle construction and maintenance was substantial. Building a major stone castle required enormous resources, creating employment for masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, and laborers, often for years or even decades. Once built, castles needed constant maintenance and supplies, supporting local economies through the purchase of food, materials, and services. Castle garrisons provided a ready market for nearby farmers, artisans, and merchants, while castle-based officials created demand for luxury goods and specialized services. The presence of a castle could transform local economic patterns, stimulating the development of markets, crafts, and services. Towns that grew alongside castles often received special privileges like market rights or tax exemptions, further enhancing their economic prospects. In frontier regions, castles provided the security necessary for economic development, protecting trade routes and creating safe zones for settlement and agriculture. Castles also function as cultural centers, particularly those that served as residences for wealthy nobles or royalty. Great halls hosted feasts, ceremonies, and entertainments, including performances by musicians, poets, and other artists. Castle chapels employed priests and sometimes choirs, contributing to religious and musical culture. Some castle libraries contain valuable manuscripts, making them centers of learning and intellectual activity. The cultural role of castles is vividly illustrated in literary sources. Medieval romances frequently describe castle life, with scenes of feasting, tournaments, and courtly love unfolding against the backdrop of great halls and castle gardens. These literary depictions, while often idealized, capture something of the cultural significance that castles held in medieval imagination, representing not just military power but civilization and refinement amid an often dangerous world. The castle is a symbol of authority worked on multiple levels. Physically, these massive stone structures dominated landscapes, visible from miles away as reminders of their owner's power. Architecturally, they incorporated elements specifically designed to impress and intimidate, from soaring towers to elaborate gatehouses with heraldic decoration. Socially, they reinforced hierarchies through their internal organization, with clear distinctions between spaces for elites and those for servants or soldiers. The symbolic function of castles sometimes outweigh their practical military value, even as developments in artillery made traditional castle defenses increasingly obsolete. Rulers continue to build and maintain castles as statements of their status and legitimacy. In some cases, Older castles were modernized with gun ports and artillery platforms, not because they remained strategically essential, but because abandoning them might signal weakness or decline. The legacy of medieval castles extends far beyond their original functions. Many survive today as tourist attractions, museums, hotels, or private residences. Others exist only as romantic ruins, evoking the past while blending into natural landscapes. Even those that have disappeared completely often leave traces in place names, local legends, or archaeological remains. Their enduring presence in the physical landscape mirrors their persistent hold on our cultural imagination. Returning to the knights who built and inhabited these castles, it's worth exploring further how this warrior class navigated the complex social and political landscapes of medieval Europe. Knights occupied an ambiguous position in medieval society, serving as both defenders and potential threats to social order. Their relationship with the monarchs they nominally served was particularly nuanced, characterized by mutual dependence but also frequent tension. Kings relied on knights to form the core of royal armies, administer distant territories, and enforce royal authority at the local level. In return, knights expected their monarchs to recognize and protect their privileges, reward loyal service with grants of land or office, and uphold the feudal contracts that defined the relationship. When kings failed to meet these expectations, knights might transfer their allegiance to rival claimants or rebel outright. The tension between royal authority and knightly autonomy is vividly illustrated by events like the signing of Magna Carta in 1215, when English knights and barons forced King John to acknowledge limits on royal power. Similar conflicts occurred across Europe throughout the medieval period, as monarchs sought to centralize authority while knights and nobles worked to preserve their traditional rights and powers. The outcome of these struggles varied widely by region and period, shaping the diverse political landscapes of medieval Europe. Knights also maintained complex relationships with the peasants who worked their lands. The ideals of chivalry included protecting the weak, suggesting a paternalistic responsibility toward peasant communities. In practice, however, knights often exploited their power over rural populations, extracting heavy rents and labor services. Peasant rebellions like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 or the French Jacquerie of 1358 revealed the tensions inherent in this unequal relationship. Women's roles in relation to knighthood and castle life were more significant than often portrayed in popular culture. While women could not become knights, noble women played crucial roles in medieval society, particularly as castellans responsible for defending fortresses when their husbands were away. Historical records contain numerous examples of women who successfully commanded castle garrisons during sieges, making tactical decisions kings and inspiring defenders. The Lady Nicolette de la Haye provides a compelling example. During the First Barons' War in England, she defended Lincoln Castle against rebel forces for nearly 4 months in 1217, despite being in her 60s at the time. Her successful defense contributed significantly to the Royalist victory in the conflict. Similarly, Jean de Clisson, known as the Lioness of Brittany, defended multiple castles during the Breton War of Succession in the 14th century. Even in peacetime, noble women managed extensive households and estates, often while their knightly husbands were occupied with military service, court attendance, or other duties. Castle mistresses supervised domestic staff, oversaw food production and storage, managed household finances, and maintained the social connections essential for their family's prosperity and security. These administrative responsibilities required considerable skill, knowledge, and authority. Women also influenced knightly culture through the ideals of courtly love that emerged in the 12th century. This complex cultural system, celebrated in the poetry of troubadours and the romances of Chrétien de Troyes, placed noble women on pedestals as objects of devotion and sources of inspiration for knights. While the reality of gender relations was far more complicated than these literary ideals suggest, courtly love traditions did provide noble women with certain forms of cultural power and influence. The children of knights received educations appropriate to their expected future roles. Boys destined for knighthood began their training early, learning horsemanship, weapons handling, and other martial skills alongside academic subjects and courtly behavior. Girls from knightly families were typically educated in household management, needlework, music, and religious instruction, preparing them for their future roles as wives and mothers in noble households. Education for noble children often took place within castle settings, either in their own families' castles or those of relatives or allies where they might be sent as part of political alliances. Castle life thus served as a school of sorts, where young people learned through observation and then practiced the skills they would need as adult members of the knightly class. This educational function represented yet another way that castles shaped medieval society beyond their military role. The lives of knights and the history of castles were intimately connected with the development of medieval warfare, which changed dramatically over the course of the Middle Ages. Early medieval battles were relatively simple affairs, with limited tactics and organization. By the High Middle Ages, however, warfare had become more sophisticated, with combined arms tactics integrating knights, infantry, and missile troops. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 illustrates an important transitional moment in medieval warfare. William of Normandy's victory relied on the effective coordination knights, infantry, and archers, with knights delivering repeated charges against the Anglo-Saxon shield wall. The battle demonstrated both the effectiveness of heavy cavalry and its limitations when faced with disciplined infantry in strong defensive positions. By the 12th and 13th centuries, knights had become the elite striking force of medieval armies, capable of delivering devastating charges that could break enemy formations. The development of the couch lance technique, where a knight braced his lance under his arm rather than thrusting with it, increased the impact force significantly. Combined with stirrups, specialized saddles, and increasingly effective armor, this made the mounted knight a formidable battlefield presence. However, knights were never invincible, and effective counters to heavy cavalry emerged throughout the medieval period. Scottish schiltrons, dense formations of spearmen, proved deadly against English knights at Bannockburn in 1314. English longbowmen devastated French knights at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt during the 100 Years' War. Swiss pike squares demonstrated similar effectiveness against Burgundian knights in the late 15th century. The increasing effectiveness of infantry against cavalry reflected broader social and economic changes. As towns grew wealthier and more powerful, they could field well-equipped citizen militias. Centralizing monarchies developed more professional armies less dependent on feudal service. These trends gradually eroded the battlefield supremacy of knights, though heavy cavalry remained important through the end of the medieval period and beyond. Siege warfare evolved alongside field battles, with increasingly sophisticated techniques for both attack and defense. Early medieval sieges often relied on simple blockade, cutting off supplies until hunger forced surrender. By the High Middle Ages, attackers employed specialized equipment like trebuchets, siege towers, and mining operations, while defenders countered with improved architectural features and active defense measures. The introduction of gunpowder weapons in the late medieval period fundamentally altered both field battles and sieges. Early cannon were unreliable and slow-firing, but they improved rapidly. By the mid-15th century, artillery could effectively breach stone walls, dramatically reducing the defensive value of traditional castles. Knights faced similar challenges on the battlefield, as firearms gradually rendered even the finest plate armor obsolete. These military developments contributed to broader social and political changes in late medieval Europe. As professional armies replaced feudal hosts, and artillery made traditional castles less effective, the military foundations of knighthood eroded. Simultaneously, economic changes like the growth of commerce and the increasing monetization of economies undermined the economic basis of feudal relationships. Knights increasingly found themselves themselves adapting to a changing world where their traditional roles and privileges were no longer secure. Some knights successfully navigated these changes by embracing new roles as courtiers, administrators, or military commanders in increasingly professional armies. Others found themselves marginalized, unable to maintain the expensive trappings of knighthood in an era when their military value was declining. By the early modern period, knighthood had largely transformed from a functional military class to a purely honorific status, while castles evolved from military necessities to symbols of prestige and authority. Despite these transformations, the cultural legacy of medieval knighthood and castle building proved remarkably durable. Renaissance princes and early modern monarchs continued to invoke chivalric ideals and imagery, even as actual warfare moved ever further from medieval patterns. Castle architecture influenced later palace design, with defensive elements retained for symbolic purposes long after they ceased to have practical military value. This cultural persistence reached its peak during the Gothic revival of the 18th and 19th centuries, when interest in medieval architecture, literature, and values surged across Europe and North America. Wealthy industrialists built mock medieval castles, writers reimagined Arthurian legends, and civic buildings adopted neo-Gothic styles. This romanticized vision of the Middle Ages reflected contemporary concerns as much as historical reality, projecting Victorian values onto medieval knights and castles. The modern fascination with knights and castles builds on this Gothic revival foundation, filtered through subsequent literary, film, and gaming interpretations. From Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court to films like Excalibur and Monty Python and the Holy Grail. From historical novels to fantasy role-playing games, medieval knights and castles continue to inspire creative reimaginings. Each generation seems to find something compelling in these images of armored warriors and stone fortresses, adapting them to express contemporary concerns and aspirations. Academic understanding of medieval knights and castles has also evolved significantly, particularly in recent decades. Archaeological investigations using advanced technologies have revealed new details about castle construction and daily life. Careful analysis of surviving documents has provided more nuanced views of knightly culture and behavior. Interdisciplinary approaches combining history, archaeology, literature, and material culture studies have created richer, more complex pictures of medieval society. These scholarly advances have challenged many popular misconceptions about knights and castles. Rather than dark, uncomfortable spaces, we now know that many castles were colorfully decorated, well-lit, and relatively comfortable by medieval standards. Rather than spending all their time fighting, knights were often occupied with estate management, legal matters, wars, and other peacetime activities. These more nuanced understandings enrich rather than diminish our appreciation of medieval achievements. As we conclude our exploration of medieval knights and castles, it's worth reflecting on why these subjects continue to fascinate us across centuries and cultures. Perhaps it's because they represent both the harsh realities of power and violence and the human aspiration toward honor, courage, and protection of the vulnerable. Knights and castles embody contradictions that remain relevant today. Between security and freedom, between violence and order, between individual prowess and collective welfare. The enduring appeal of knights and castles also reflects their visual and symbolic power. The silhouette of a castle on a hilltop or the image of a mounted knight in full armor speaks directly to our imagination, evoking an age when power and values were made visible in stone and steel. In our digital age, where authority often seems abstract and intangible, there's something compelling about these concrete embodiments of medieval power. Finally, perhaps we remain fascinated by knights and castles because they represent a world both radically different from our own and connected to it through unbroken threads of cultural inheritance. When we visit a medieval castle or contemplate the ideals of chivalry, we encounter both the otherness of the past and its continuing presence in our cultural DNA. This dialectic between familiarity and strangeness makes the study of knights and castles not just an exploration of history, but a means of reflecting on our own society and values. In castles, we see the human desire for security made manifest in stone, while in knights we recognize the perennial tension between violence and honor, power and responsibility. Together, they offer windows into a world both distant and familiar, reminding us that while the specific forms of human societies change over time, many fundamental concerns and aspirations remain remarkably constant. This continuity amid change is perhaps the most valuable lesson that medieval knights and castles continue to teach us today. As we've journeyed through the world of medieval knights and castles, we've explored how these iconic elements of the Middle Ages developed, functioned, and eventually transformed. From simple wooden fortifications to massive stone complexes, from mounted warriors to a distinct social class bound by codes of chivalry, the evolution of castles and knights reflects broader patterns of medieval history. Their legacy continues to resonate in our culture, architecture, literature, and imagination, connecting us to a past that remains vibrantly present in stone monuments and enduring ideals. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of medieval knights and castles, these fascinating symbols of an age when courage was measured in steel and power was written in stone. May their stories continue to inspire and instruct us, bridging the centuries with timeless images of human strength, skill, and aspiration.